Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Teddy Roosevelt once said, "It's not the critic who counts, but the credit belongs to the man in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." Welcome back, and thank you for supporting the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy for the last 23 years now. I'm Chris William, and while it is easy work these days to default to some Democratic or Republican point of view, the harder part is distilling out what is pure party rhetoric and what truly is bona fide policy worth debating in a civil and informed way. It's not new news, but the Republican Party in North Carolina is in charge. But how do we sift through the emotionally charged dialogue? And what does the Tar Heel State's top political boss think? And how does he see his role in leading this region's way forward? In a moment, North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded September 25th, 2014. On this week's program, an executive profile featuring North Carolina's Governor Pat McCrory. Now, here's Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program. Welcome back, Governor. Welcome back to the dialogue, and I guess
Thanks,
back
Chris.
to Charlotte.
Oh, it's always good to be home. Get to sleep with my wife and dog tonight, so looking forward to it.
Governor, I almost don't know where to start. So here we are, almost halfway through your term. When you look back on it, when you look forward on it, is it hard to believe that it's been 17 or 18 months, closing in on halftime? And if you had to say now what a legacy for a term as governor would be, what would you want that to be?
Well, first of all, I don't believe in a politician trying to go after a legacy. I didn't believe it when I was mayor of Charlotte for 14 years, nor did I want to be the education governor or the jobs governor or the healthcare governor. My goal is to be governor and to lead. And I think what I'm shooting for, just like I did as mayor, is to implement policy and execute that policy in which the next generation and the generation of that will benefit. Just like when I was mayor of Charlotte, we're now benefiting from the transportation initiatives that we set forth way back in 1996. We're seeing that to fruition now. And because that's how long it really takes to determine whether that policy was successful or not. So as I try to implement new education policy, new tax policy, new transportation vision for the next 25 years, which myself and Secretary Tata just rolled out during the past week, I really won't know whether we did a good job or not, probably until 10 or 20 years. But our decision shouldn't be based upon the next election. Our decision should be based upon the next generation. And that's what I'm attempting to do,
I'm sorry
like I did as mayor.
But how do you do that? So you came into office, and Republicans have been in charge for 2 years when you came into office. So there were some priorities set. So how do you? Well, let me back up. What are your priorities? What do you want to get done?
Well, in my first year as governor, to my surprise, my major priority was the execution and operations of state government. Most people don't know this. Most of the discussion in state government and in federal government over the airwaves is about policy, politics, and power, when in fact the governor's main job is operations and execution. For example, little things like, why are people waiting an hour and a half to get their driver's license in North Carolina, or even 2 hours? Execution of why did we have a $535 million cost overrun or miscalculation on Medicaid reform. Why is that so broken? It's an operational issue. Why, for example, is certain revenue being spent in certain areas where on maintenance of buildings we had almost no money on the operation and maintenance of buildings, and therefore we have roofs caving in, HVA systems over cost, and operations not working efficiently and effectively. So myself and my cabinet, which I have a great cabinet, my first goal was to put together a great team, and my second goal was to deal on operations. And now as I enter the second and third part of my first term, we're now focusing on long-term policy, transportation policy, education policy, and also fiscal policy. And just today, I've been across the state on trying to fill the skills gap of North Carolina. As I meet with employers across North Carolina, we're seeing and we're getting feedback that there are thousands of job openings, but we don't have the people qualified to fill those job openings, whether they're IT, mechanical, electrical, technical, truck drivers, the list goes on and on. So I'm trying to bring education and commerce together in a long-term policy, and then we've got to execute that policy which succeeds whoever is governor.
Doesn't that skills gap, isn't that a bit ironic in a state like North Carolina, when we're so proud of our higher education system, our community college system?
Sure.
Isn't that a bit of an irony, and why is there that skills gap?
No, it's actually a trend that's happened nationally. Part of it is a cultural trend where in the past 2 or 3 decades, all the students were being told the only way to become successful is to get a 4-year college degree regardless of major. And what we've basically learned is, wait a minute, we're losing our mechanics and our electricians and our plumbers, and those are high-paying, needed jobs in our economy. And the students during the last 10 years were getting away from those jobs, and yet then graduating with a sociology major from even our best universities, and they were wondering why they were unemployed, because there were no jobs in those areas. But there are jobs in welding, for example, 6-figure jobs. So we've got a major educational effort, a cultural educational effort, to convince education leaders that, wait a minute, we ought to be directing our curriculum and our academic initiatives toward where the jobs are, so students aren't burdened with not just debt, but also without a job.
So is that educating the parents, the kids, or is that throwing more money at the education system, which is already a challenge?
No, it's reprioritizing our money in our education system and educating the kids, but not waiting until their senior year in high school or in college to educate them. We've actually got to reach them at their middle schools. I just got back from a great company in Greensboro, a trucking company in Greensboro, where there are literally thousands of truck driver openings right now. And yet our unemployment rate's over 6%. So we're finding out the details of how can we fill those thousands of truck driver jobs, which is not a position that most people think about of being a good occupation, but it's an occupation that we need, and the pay is going up because the demand is very high. The same thing with welders, the same thing with technicians. Earlier this morning, I was at a major software company in the Triangle, in which they're looking for IT professionals, a company that's going from 600 to 800 people in the next year. And they literally are having a difficult time finding IT specialists, people who can program, people who can develop IT software. And Siemens, I was at Siemens yesterday morning in Charlotte, where they have this incredible technology which runs these huge turbines that they're building and repairing for future gas turbine and nuclear power plants. And every one of these is run by a high-tech piece of machine. It doesn't require a lot of people, but it requires skilled people. And we've got to change the academic thinking and the cultural thinking of America to convince people there are good ways to make living in areas that we thought we'd given up on. You know, in the past decade or so, we'd given up. People were being told there won't be any manufacturing jobs in the future, and that's just not true.
Governor, how did North Carolina, and you know, you've been in this state a long time. You bleed North Carolina.
Yeah, I do.
Maybe not Tar Heel blue, but certainly you bleed North Carolina.
I bleed North Carolina.
How did North Carolina, in that same vein and let's talk a little bit about the brand and education and economic development. How did North Carolina find itself kind of back on its heels in the way of trying to defend itself. That wait a minute, we are a progressive state with a small p. We think about education, we think about economic development, we have great industry here, but here we are to, and please correct me if I'm wrong, find ourselves defending maybe something that the New York Times will print, or someone out west will say, well, North Carolina, the Republicans can't get along, or whatever it is. But how do we, what is this brand of North Carolina? Is it broken?
I don't. I think what happens with any successful organization or successful state or even a successful city that I help lead, you start taking it for granted. I remember meeting a top soft drink executive who one time told me, I said, what happened? Why are you falling back in your sales? And he says, we all got in a room and our back was turned to the customer and we were bragging about how good we're doing, and we didn't realize our customers were leaving us and our competition was doing anything they could to take our customers. So North Carolina's brand in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was very, very strong. We did some unique things like the Research Triangle Park. We did the banking here in Charlotte and things of that nature. But in the meantime, we kind of went, the heck with South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. We're beating them. Well, guess what? They had their backs to the walls, and they started implementing long-term strategy while we were just assuming without strategy we'd continue. It's a typical group organizational dynamic, and I saw this as mayor of Charlotte, that you can never take your brand for granted, and you've constantly got to update your brand and change your brand. And that's why we're implementing a 25-year transportation plan for the state of North Carolina now. I need to show a vision to industry in the state and to the citizens of our state on what this state will look like in infrastructure in 25 years. Very similar to what Eisenhower did for our nation. So Tony, Secretary Tate, and myself are presenting a plan of connectivity between rural and urban areas, connectivity between North Carolina and South Carolina, Tennessee and Virginia, connectivity to our ports and our airports, connectivity to our travel and tourism. So we're going to show this master interconnectivity plan of communications, of water, of rail, and of roads. And we got to show that vision. You know, it was just 1996, not too long ago, when I was, 40 years old, and I was a freshman mayor here in Charlotte, where we started talking about a 25-year transportation plan. Well, they're in the 20th year of that plan now.
So
that's the way we need to think in North Carolina. That's the way we're going to beat the competition. I tell this to Nikki Haley all the time, my good friend Nikki, or Bill Haslam in Tennessee, or Terry McCulloch in Virginia.
But when you talk about transportation, and people hear a policy person talking about transportation, they think roads and bridges. Help us understand that transportation is about culture. And I don't want to be leading on this question, Governor, but is it more about building culture and communities as much as it is about putting in
I think it's really more about economic development policy. Sharon Decker, who you know real well, used to start the show up for you occasionally, a great commerce secretary. She and I firmly believe, first of all, there's a disconnect between urban economic centers and rural towns that are kind of left by themselves in America, not just North Carolina. So we have the Rutherfordtons of the world, where Sharon's from, or the Wadesboroughs of the world, or the Tarboroughs, or the Roxboroughs, who cannot be on an island by themselves anymore, because the old islands, which used to survive on one manufacturing plant, is gone now. So our goal of our whole transportation plan is to connect the economic zones throughout North Carolina, Wilmington and Charlotte and Greensboro and High Point and Asheville and Greenville, and connect those zones even with Norfolk and with Columbia and with Greenville and with Johnson, Tennessee, going across the border. And with that, we also want to connect the towns of 20 to 50,000 people, so they have opportunity to share in the economic growth of areas like Charlotte or the Triangle or the Triad or Wilmington and Asheville, which are doing quite well right now in this recovery. You know, when I became governor, our unemployment rate was the 5th highest in the nation, and we've had to make some very difficult short-term operational and policy decisions, which have caught the wrath of the New York Times. But a year and a half later, we've had the largest drop in unemployment in the nation, next to Florida.
I don't want to leave the transportation issue for a second, because you have been very, very deliberate, very intentional about a transportation plan. You talked about it last summer, and recently you talked about maybe borrowing $1 billion. That's right. To do something about the rural and specific projects. Is that starter cash? Because
That's
it sure
starter cash.
seems like
That's-
transportation is a
no.
much bigger issue.
That $1 billion is to get about 25 projects that are project ready off the drawing board and on the ground. That's just a starter. I hope by next year we'll be presenting a total plan on how to execute and implement transportation infrastructure across the state, just like I did when I was mayor of Charlotte here. You need to first show a vision of where you plan to go, and then you make the ask.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just make the ask for money and say, trust us on how we're going to spend it, we're not going to win. You know, when I was mayor here and now when I'm governor, I always got upset when I saw the highway system in North Carolina. You talk about the good old days of North Carolina, but actually our highway system was going from 2 lanes to 8 lanes to 2 lanes back to 4 lanes.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about as you
very
travel
well.
throughout North Carolina. And wherever it was widest, it was named after a politician, you know, a state senator, a governor, a DOT board member. Well, that usually meant the decisions were being based upon politics. And what we're attempting to do is take the politics out of where we build our transportation infrastructure and do it based upon data. And the main data is where the cars are, where the congestion is, where can we save lives due to safety, and also where can we create jobs, especially where areas of this state need the jobs the most. And that's through the connectivity, connecting the rural towns with the major economic centers of the mountain, Piedmont, eastern, and coastal regions of the state. And some of those centers, for example, Elizabeth City, in the northeast part of their state, which is really getting hurt by this economy. They haven't rebounded as well as, for example, Charlotte, Nashville, and Wilmington. Their best connectivity, this is coming from the governor of North Carolina, is going to be with Virginia. We think, just like Rock Hill, South Carolina's best economic opportunity is to connect to Charlotte.
Well, and I would say, and you
The
have
borders
talked,
mean nothing. in
and,
economic
well, and you've
development.
talked about this before, and I don't know that the folks in Wilmington necessarily like to hear this, but the best option to connect to a port is Charleston from Charlotte.
That's right. That's one reason. And we've got to understand that. That's why in Wilmington, for example, one of my infrastructure goals is to have Highway 74 be a straight line between Asheville all the way through Charlotte, Shelby, then Charlotte, all the way through Wadesboro, straight to Wilmington. So those people in the western part of the state have another port to choose from. But right now the infrastructure goes straight toward Charleston. Plus, we need to do some basic infrastructure improvement, immediate. You know, when I became governor, I found out the Wilmington port had no refrigeration. I mean, and agriculture, by the way, is another major goal of mine. I was an urban mayor, but I'm a big advocate of agriculture. Agriculture is helping North Carolina get out of this recession.
Well,
But we've got to export the agriculture through our Wilmington and Morehead City ports, and at times Norfolk and Charleston.
You have made a reference to being mayor of Charlotte 3 different times here, and I want to go back to that because it seems like what a great training ground, certainly for the transportation issue. And again, Mayor, this is not a leading question, but what surprised you most about going from a town like Charlotte as mayor and being governor of North Carolina? And let's stick to the transportation issue for now. What was different about leading a vision in Charlotte, and especially with the Blue Line that was been wildly popular? How do you take that vision and how do you spread that over 2 different states in North Carolina, rural and urban, and how do you bring that
Well, I
together?
probably first had to break through a political culture at the state level, which was, to be frank, a good old boy culture of, Governor, this is the way we do things here. And that's not going to prepare us for the next 25 years. So during the first year, some of my harshest critics were those who wanted to protect the status quo of how we've always done things, because some people benefited from the old way we would build roads or the old way we had determined where roads went. You know, it might have been based upon where the most powerful politician happened to live, or where the committee chairman or DOT member happened to live. So what we've attempted to do is take the politics out of the road building, very similar to what I did as mayor when I took the politics out of where we put our bus lines. It used to be every city council member here in Charlotte would kind of have political influence of where the bus line was, regardless of the volume of bus riders. One of my major objectives, and it was successful, was we got the city council members out of the day-to-day operations of the bus line, and I'm so far doing that also with our legislature.
But it's not just Democrat, it's also Republican.
It's Republicans and Democrats. It's bipartisan culture that we have to break. And probably one of my biggest challenges as governor is, and this is, I'm saying this in respect, the legislators, they work so hard. They come in, they make no money whatsoever. I don't know how they do it. And they sacrifice their family and their work. But when they come in, very similar to council members when I was mayor, sometimes they want to micromanage the executive department. And right now I'm probably taking a little stand even against my Republicans saying, let the executive be the executive. Let us look at the operations. Let us look at DMV. Let us look at building operations. Let us look at the budgeting process. And it's stepping on the toes of the way the legislators probably had a lot more control, at least under the last two administrations, than I thought was good for North Carolina.
So even when the leaders get together and try to hash things out, the president of the Senate, Phil Berger, and Tom Tillis in the House, and yourself, and have difficulty or don't always agree, and that boils out into the open, and it seems to be more than it is. How much does it hurt the brand and the state when it seems that Republicans don't get along?
Oh, I think first of all, you got to be careful. The brand that you're reading in the New York Times is being sent to the New York Times from people of the opposing party. So be very careful what you read and what the motive is of what you read from both sides of the political spectrum. But sometimes as governor, I try to work out the differences behind closed doors. But sometimes as governor, I've got to use the bully pulpit to sell the differences and to convince the public what I'm doing is long term. So, our framers of our Constitution, both at the federal level and the state level, made things messy for a reason. They get to see the spaghetti being made or the sausage being made. And I try not to have too many public conflicts, but if I do, it's always going to be respectful of the position. It happened when I was mayor, and it's going to happen when I'm governor. But I'd rather have that transparent dialogue, open dialogue, than behind-the-scenes deals that are made for short-term political needs versus a long-term sustainable solution for North Carolina.
How does...
And that's the risk.
And we've got about 3 minutes left, and we haven't talked about Medicare or Medicaid. How do you... Yeah, and we can do that in 3 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Is there a way, is there a model that you could see that North Carolina would begin to consider to take the Medicaid, the dollars from federal Medicaid?
There could be. Again, I inherited a $500 million misforecast of Medicaid and some serious computer problems and customer service issues and talent issues that we need desperately in government at this point in time. So I'm fixing those, and we've made tremendous progress, but there's a long way to go. But I'm doing a parallel track. I'm also looking at what they're doing in Pennsylvania and Indiana and Utah and other states to see if we can look for certain waivers. One thing I've learned in medicine and our healthcare system, which is our country's biggest challenge and our state's biggest challenge, is there is no one plan that can fit everyone in this nation or, frankly, in this state. So what I'm looking for is permission from the federal government to let us do North Carolina's plan. And even within North Carolina's plan, the Charlotte plan will be much more different than the Goldsboro's plan or than Asheville's plan or the North Wilkesboro plan. The different regions of the state have different hospitals. They have different constituencies, different demographics, different financial needs, and more Medicaid or Medicaid patients. I want each region to have their own plan. And Aldona Voss, my Secretary of Health and Human Services, she's one of the most incredible leaders. She's ridiculed in some of the Raleigh and Charlotte newspapers, but I put her picture next to public service. She's working for $1 a year, and she's a doctor herself. She's out getting the solutions from doctors and bringing them to me. Just like in the area of education, some of the education reform is we got the ideas from teachers and principals and superintendents, not inside the Beltline in Raleigh.
We've got about a minute left. Would you, recently, Carolina's healthcare system, one of the biggest in the country, and certainly in the Carolinas, announced that we're going to have to cut $100 million, or we're going to cut $100 million, and some 100 senior management positions among some others. This is a pretty draconian cut. Does Health and Human Services, does the healthcare structure in North Carolina have to pay attention to what hospitals will be facing?
Yes, but the fact of the matter is, the economic model for hospitals, for doctors, for government health care, for insurance companies is not sustainable. It is not sustainable. It's going to go bankrupt. There's a bubble right now for hospitals. There's a bubble on how much government can continue to afford. So what I'm trying to do as governor, and it's not easy because there's a lot of turf, there's a lot of protection,
Right.
and everyone's trying to survive the next year.
Would you come back and keep talking about that?
I'd love to.
Can I? You promise to come back?
Come to the house in Raleigh. We'll
Okay.
have your show right there.
All right. Thank you, Governor. Nice to see you again.
Great to see you, Chris.
Welcome back.
Thanks. Thanks.
Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.